Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Massimo Rosini. I'm the Acting Vice Chancellor for Research and Innovation and Dean of the Institutes here at CU Boulder. And it is my honor to welcome you and distinct pleasure to welcome you to our 120th Distinguished Lecture. Thank you for coming in such a numerous number and high number today. We're really pleased with the attendance. The Distinguished Research Lectureship is among the highest honors that faculty at CU Boulder grant upon a fellow faculty member. And it is also one of the most exciting events that we host and organize here in the Research and Innovation Office. This honor recognizes a faculty member who has demonstrated world-class contribution in teaching, research, professional leadership, and service. And it acknowledges a faculty leader who exemplifies the ultimate positive impact of a truly well-rounded professor and scholar. Today, Dr. Rubén Donato, the Bob and Judy Charles Endowed Chair and a Professor of Educational Foundations, Policy and Practice in the School of Education, rightfully joins a very distinguished group of scholars as the 120th Distinguished Research Lecturer. Please, let's give him a round of applause. It's also my very distinct pleasure and I'm excited that this year's honor marks the second Distinguished Research Lectureship awarded to a faculty member from the School of Education, and I think it's really important. The School of Education is widely recognized as a national leader in scholarly and research productivity and contribution, and the university is proud to be hosting such a great school. So I'd like to introduce Kathy Schultz, the Dean of the School of Education, who will introduce our distinguished speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce Professor Rubén Donato. Professor Donato received his BA from the University of California at Santa Cruz and his MA and PhD from Stanford University. Professor Donato studies the historical dimensions of educational inequality and focuses on the educational experiences of Mexican Americans in the United States. In addition to taking on important leadership roles in our professional community and in our school, Professor Donato was designated an American Education Research Association, AERA, Fellow. AERA is our field's premier professional society, and the Fellow designation honors individuals for their cumulative, exceptional contributions to scholarship and education. In 2018, Professor Donato was awarded the Distinguished Career Contribution to Education by the American Education Research Association. And most recently, he received the Boulder Faculty Assembly's Excellence in Teaching and Pedagogy Award and CU Boulder's Robert L. Stearns Award. In 2020, Professor Donato was elected to the National Academy of Education, one of our field's highest honors of educational researchers in the United States. Professor Donato has made notable contributions, as you will hear today, to the history of Mexican Americans in educational systems in the United States through careful historical research and a sharp critical analysis. His analysis is original, and his books and journal articles are highly respected within the field of educational history. The scholars who provide external letters assessing Professor Donato's research have viewed his work as important and influential. For instance, Jonathan Zimmerman, professor of history of education at the University of Pennsylvania, declared that, quote, Rubén is a brilliant and original scholar whose work has cast new light on our understanding of education and the Latino experience. His scholarship is well known in the USA and abroad, especially in Latin America. Indeed, I would rank Rubén as one of the 2 or 3 most influential and important historians publishing in this area of study. Professor Donato's first book, The Other Struggle for Equal Schools, Mexican Americans During the Civil Rights Era, has been used in university courses across the country. His second book, Mexicans and Hispanos in Colorado Schools and Communities, 1920 to 1960, received the Educational Studies Critic Choice Award. In his current book, just released in 2021, The Other American Dilemma, Schools, Mexicans, and the Nature of Jim Crow, 1912 to 1953, Professor Donato and Gerard Hansen venture outside of the American Southwest. They maintain that Americans, whether recent immigrants, American citizens, or Hispanas with deep roots in the United States, were not seen as true Americans and were subject to unofficial segregation and Jim Crow during that period of analysis. So for more on this, please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Donato.
Thank you, Dean Schultz, for the introduction. I appreciate it. Thank you all for being here on this very cold day. It is an incredible opportunity and privilege to give this lecture, and it is one I do not take lightly, nor do I presume that I come to this stage alone. I want to thank those who took the time to nominate me, Professors Arturo Cortez and Joe Pullman. I thank the Distinguished Lecture Committee for selecting me. It is an honor to be selected among one's peers. I especially want to thank Gerard Hansen, a former doctoral student in the School of Education. Gerard and I have been working together since 2012. Gerard is a former lawyer and a senior instructor at CU Denver. I could not have written this book that we just put out without Gerard. Gerard, will you please stand? And finally, there is family. I dedicate this lecture to the memory of my father, who passed 6 years ago. And so, with this, let me begin. I came to the US when I was 5 years old from Mexico. My father brought us to Santa Cruz, California after our immigration documents were approved. We landed in Santa Cruz because my father was able to find full-time employment, and it allowed us to establish permanent roots. As I look back at my educational history, Santa Cruz was very different in the 1960s. I attended all-white public schools. The University of California campus was opened in 1965, and it was located about 6 miles from my house. When the time came, I remember driving to campus to inquire about the admissions process. I recall one individual, Noe Lozano. Noe Lozano asked me several questions, and then he encouraged me to apply. I did. Several years later, I received a bachelor's degree in history and a teaching credential. After I graduated, I became a public school teacher. When I was teaching, I was persuaded by a very good friend to apply for graduate school. Again, I did. When I began my doctoral program in the early 1980s, I was interested in history, education, and the Mexican American people. I combined these interests and wanted to study the historical experiences of Mexican Americans in public schools. But in my first year as a doctoral student, I discovered that very little had been written on the subject. I was disappointed. The body of literature was slim. In fact, there was only one book written on the subject. Thomas P. Carter wrote a book called Mexican Americans in Schools, A History of Educational Neglect. It was published in 1970. His book was important. It broke new ground. It influenced me. But I knew much more needed to be done. I knew it was going to be tough, but my doctoral advisor encouraged me to push forward and follow my heart. When I began my academic career, research about the history of Mexican American education started to emerge. Cutting-edge articles and books were starting to come out. We were learning about what it was like for Mexican American children in public schools during the first half of the 20th century in the Southwest. We learned how Mexican American children were unwanted in public schools, how they were forced to attend separate classrooms and separate schools, how they were pushed into vocational classes, how they were seen as intellectually inferior, and how they were expected to leave school at an early age. It's a complicated history. As historian Gilbert Gonzalez boldly declared, the underpinnings of their segregated school experience, one that included Americanization, testing, tracking, and vocational education, became a system that was designed to process Mexican children as a source of cheap labor. In many communities, he said, schools were used to maintain the low status of Mexican Americans within local political economies. As the body of research grew, we were also learning how Mexican immigrants, Mexican Americans, and Hispanos, those with deep roots in southern Colorado and northern New Mexico, were resisting school segregation. In my classes here at CU, some of my students were surprised to learn that Mexican American communities were challenging school segregation during the pre-Brown era. Most notably were the Del Rio case in 1930 in Texas, the Lemon Grove case in 1931 in California, and the Mendez case in 1947 in California. These cases did not reach the Supreme Court. They did, however, say something about Mexican American parents. They knew school segregation was wrong. They resisted, and they contested the practice in the courts. I'm going to briefly touch on the educational experiences of Mexican Americans in southern Colorado, central Louisiana, Kansas City, Kansas, and a case in California. These locations will give you a sense of their experiences in different parts of the United States. In 2017, I co-authored an article with Gonzalo Guzman and Jared Hansen in the Journal of Latinos in Education. We examined a school desegregation case that took place in southern Colorado. A case that went unnoticed for more than 100 years. In Alamosa, between 1912 and 1914. The story, in brief, goes like this. Francisco Maestas moved his family to the white side of town in Alamosa. Mr. Maestas wanted to send his son, Miguel, to a school that was close to his home, the Northside School. When Mr. Maestas tried to enroll his son at the school, school officials would not admit him. They told Mr. Maestas to enroll his son at the School for Spanish Children, or better known as the Mexican School. Miguel was ordered to attend a school that was further from his home, and it was located across the tracks. Those are tracks. Mr. Maestas made several complaints, but his complaints fell on deaf ears. As a result, the Mexican American community organized. They staged a boycott, and with the help of a local priest, they raised money in the community, and they hired an attorney from Denver. They hired Raymond Sullivan. The case is called Francisco Maestas et al. Versus George Schoen et al. This case is unique because Mexican Americans, plaintiffs, maintained their children were being denied admission to a white school because they were racially distinct as Mexicans. They argued it was illegal to segregate their children because the Colorado Constitution prohibited classifying and distinguishing public school children based on color and race. Defendants, school board members, and the superintendent, in response, argued that Mexican-American children were Caucasian. They claimed Mexican-American children were no different than other white children in the school district. The racial category of Mexican-Americans had a complicated history in the United States. It was complicated because the federal government granted American citizenship to Mexicans living in the newly seceded territory after the US-Mexican War in 1848, an area that included Alamosa. Under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, an agreement between the United States and Mexico, the naturalization of Mexican citizens suggested Mexicans had white status because US citizenship was limited to white persons during the mid-19th century. However, there was a broad understanding among Euro-Americans that Mexicans were not white. That they were not white because most were mestizos, a combination of Spanish and Indian heritage. Even as the school board and superintendent argued it was impossible to segregate Mexican children based on race, they said it was appropriate to segregate them based on language. They argued that non-English speaking Mexican-American children needed to be educated in a separate facility. However, the court found that the school district was sending all Mexican children to the Mexican school, regardless of their English-speaking abilities. In fact, the judge had Mexican-American children come to the courtroom when the case was being tried. They had an interpreter. When the interpreter asked questions to the children in Spanish, they immediately answered in English before the interpreter finished asking the questions. The children were bilingual. They were Americans. They had deep roots in southern Colorado and northern New Mexico. Judge Charles Holbrook ruled in favor of Francisco Maestas in 1914. He ruled the school officials could not prevent English-speaking Mexican-American children from attending schools of their choice. For now, this appears to be the first successful Mexican-American challenge to school segregation in the United States. 1914, in Alamosa, in Colorado. This past spring, in April, the Colorado State Senate and the House of Representatives recognized and celebrated the Maestas case. In a bipartisan vote, which is very hard to do, they commemorated the 107th anniversary of this forgotten and historic case. Let me now jump to the Deep South. It was 1915 in a small central Louisiana town. A school board member threw several Mexican children out of a white school because he said they were racially mixed. A complaint was filed with the Mexican consulate in New Orleans. An investigation was conducted. A report was written, and the information was sent to the Mexican ambassador in Washington, D.C. The Mexican ambassador then contacted the U.S. Secretary of State. In the letter sent to the U.S. Secretary of State, the Mexican ambassador described how the school board member became aggressive, how he threatened the children, their parents, and told them he would physically hurt them if they returned to the school. The Mexican ambassador asked the Secretary of State to intervene to help stop this unjust discrimination. This incident is important because individuals from the highest branches of government, both domestic and foreign, became aware that Mexican children were being intimidated and rejected from a public school because they were seen as racially mixed. While we wanted to understand how school leaders responded to the school board member, we also wanted to know how these children were perceived in a place and time where racial segregation was understood in black and white terms. A region of the nation where racial segregation functioned under the 1896 Plessy decision, the separate but equal doctrine that was law in the South. This incident became complicated. Jared and I found this case in the Mexico City archives. We then traveled to Louisiana. But we were unable to find a record of this incident in the district school board minutes. This incident was also not reported in the local press. Furthermore, the U.S. Secretary of State ordered the Louisiana governor to investigate the complaint. That order was passed on to the Louisiana State Superintendent, but there was no record of an investigation or that the state intervened. Even though information is missing, we had enough data to generate an understanding of this occurrence. One must understand the historical experiences of Mexican immigrants in the Deep South during this period to appreciate the uniqueness of this case. In her book, Corazón de Dixie, Heart of Dixie, historian Julie Weiss allowed us to understand the experiences of Mexicans in the South. She found that Mexicans arriving in Louisiana and Mississippi during the early 20th century had different experiences. Their experiences depended on social class, skin color, and where they lived and worked. Life was different for Mexicans who lived in the Mississippi Delta or rural Louisiana compared to those who settled in New Orleans. New Orleans was racially diverse, urban, and cosmopolitan. The experiences of Mexican immigrants in New Orleans more closely resembled those of European immigrants as they arrived by boat rather than crossing the U.S.-Mexican border in the Southwest. Despite the advantages middle-class Mexicans had in New Orleans, Weiss explained how they understood the color line and they knew how to mitigate the effects of Jim Crow. However, within 100 miles of New Orleans, where cotton and sugar-producing areas recruited Mexicans to work, Weiss found that Mexicans were treated similar to that of African Americans. Jim Crow also applied to them. Just to be clear, Jim Crow laws in the South did not name Mexicans, but these laws unofficially applied to them. Some of us are familiar with these signs. They can be accessed on the internet. They've been around for some time. The photos I will show you next, you probably have not seen. Jared and I accessed these images from the Mexico City archives. They are part of our recent book. They are professionally made signs that were put on the front doors of businesses in some southern communities. Let me take a few seconds here. In this last photo, you do not see a no Mexican sign. However, at the bottom of the photo and at the bottom of the paragraph, the Mexican consulate wrote something very important. In Spanish, it said, "En este lugar se sirve a los negros y también a los mexicanos." In English, it said, "In this place, they serve blacks and also Mexicans." These photos were taken in Arkansas by the Mexican consulate. Just to be clear, we discuss in our book how Mexicans were rejected from restaurants, theaters, barbershops, stores, parks, and other public places in the South. it was common for the Mexican ambassador to complain to the U.S. Secretary of State that Mexicans were experiencing Jim Crow-like conditions in public places across the nation. When school officials were discussing the actions of the school board member, the one who threw the Mexican children out of the white school, the county superintendent wrote a letter to the school principal to inform him that he had consulted with a district attorney and found there were no laws that prevented the Mexican children from attending the white school. Acting under legal advice, the county superintendent instructed the principal to admit the Mexican children into the school. But it was too late. The children were gone. They did not return to the school. We searched. They were gone from the public record. As we assembled this case, and despite what cannot be known about the racialization of Mexican children, the black-white racial world of central Louisiana made it difficult for school officials to look beyond the binary system that was firmly in place. Let me explain what I mean. School officials in this case were divided about how Mexican children should be raised. There were disagreements about whether Mexican children had Negro blood, but no one in the parish claimed Mexican children were white. We benefited from the investigative report we found in the Mexico City archives, information that was not in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. We were able to hypothesize why this case was not included in the district school board minutes and why it was not reported in the local press. We found that individuals in the parish were afraid of the school board member, the one who threw the Mexican children out of the school. They feared him because of his political and financial standing in the community. Louisiana historian Sue Aiken described how planters in this parish were the government after the 1896 Plessy decision. Aiken explained how planters owned newspapers and the power these individuals possessed in the parish. This may explain why the local press did not report the incident. The school board member in the parish was a powerful planter and banker in the community. In addition, we were also able to further understand why racial conflicts may often be hidden from the public record. Let me explain what I mean. Even though the parish was functioning under a dual system of education that was serving black and white children in separate schools, it was clear that some individuals were nervous about this incident because they did not want problems with the U.S. and Mexican governments. In fact, the parish school board president told the Mexican consulate that he didn't want the complaint to go to Washington, D.C. He implied he would have been pleased to keep the public records devoid of this incident. This may explain why the school board minutes had no record of this case. We are convinced this case was erased from their public school records. In the end, the records kept in the Mexico City archives preserves a moment in time about what we know about the experiences of Mexican children in the Deep South during that era. If the records of this incident were left to the parish school board minutes and the local press, this story would have been lost and certainly could not have been told. Let me turn to Kansas City. In our book, we examine several communities in Kansas. I'm only going to talk about the Kansas City public schools. Mexicans were being recruited to Kansas City to work on the railroads during and after the Mexican Revolution of 1910. Their numbers were small in the city compared to other locations in the Southwest. Kansas City provides a fascinating portrait of a school district because it was located 61 miles from Topeka, the place where the Brown decision was ruled in 1954. Kansas City had a dual system of education, a place where black and white students were being served in separate schools. However, it evolved into a tri-racial school system by 1924, a place where black, white, and Mexican children were attending separate school facilities. As Mexican children started to grow in the Kansas City public schools, white parents became nervous. As early as 1918, white parents met with school officials, the Parent-Teacher Association, and the Mexican Consulate to see if it was possible to create a separate school for Mexican children. By 1922, about 100 Mexican children were attending one of the district's elementary schools. As the school became overcrowded, white parents saw the condition as an opportunity to remove the children from the school. They did. Mexican children were removed from the school. A separate school for Mexican children was built in the school district in 1924. It was named the Clara Barton School. Unlike most school districts across the Southwest, where school officials were using language and pedagogical rationales to segregate Mexican children, historian Robert Clary argued there was little concern about the English language proficiency of these children. School officials assumed all Mexican children were deficient in English. For Clary, the segregation of Mexican children was based on race rather than linguistic and cultural differences. The lack of controversy over the construction of the Clara Barton School is a mystery. We do not know exactly why the separate Mexican school was built. We do know that narratives in newspapers indicated that white parents wanted the separate school. School district officials moved forward with the plan. The Mexican Consulate, in this case, acquiesced, and the Attorney General did not get involved. But it was not as simple as that. Although there was little controversy over the establishment of the Clara Barton Mexican School, there was an uproar about the exclusion and segregation of Mexican children from other schools in the district. Two cases received attention less than 1 year of each other. In the first case, a new elementary school was built in 1924. It was built for white children. The old school became a school annex, and it was designated for Mexican children. The Mexican Consulate became aware of this development. He contacted the Kansas governor and asked him why the children were going to be assigned to the school annex. He said it was going to intensify school segregation. The governor responded and agreed to investigate the issue. The governor contacted the state superintendent of instruction. The state superintendent immediately responded. In his response for the governor, we can tell that the state superintendent was furious. He told the governor that Mexican children were not being oppressed. He also told him that America was providing better schools for Mexicans than Mexico provided for their own children. The Mexican Consulate was correct that the school annex was going to intensify school segregation. The newspaper, in fact, subsequently reported that the new elementary school was going to solve a racial problem. It was going to solve a racial problem because the school annex was going to be for people of that race. For people of that race, Mexican children. But there's more to the story. The press also reported that when the new school opened for white children, 4 Mexican children arrived at the school. They did not know they were not supposed to go to that school. A riot broke out. White protesters were so hostile towards the Mexican children that the Mexican Consulate contacted the Kansas governor in a Western Union telegram to inform him that things had gotten out of control at the school. A teacher had to call the police to protect the Mexican children from the angry mob that numbered close to 200. The Mexican children were quickly taken out of the school. The Mexican children were taken out of the white school in September. They were ordered to return to school in February by a district judge. They were also told to enroll in the school annex or a school that had Mexican classrooms. At this point, nothing was being discussed about where Mexican students would attend high school. It is within this context that the next controversy emerged. Known as the Satarino Alvarado case, 4 Mexican-American students attempted to enroll at Argentine High School in 1925. Once again, a protest erupted. White parents protested the attendance of the Mexican students at Argentine High School. Under the school district's dual system of education, African Americans were attending Sumner High School, the district's black high school. Mexican American students had nowhere to go. They were not expected to go to high school. School officials immediately stepped in. They extended an offer to Mexican parents. 1, they authorized a separate room with a teacher to serve the 4 Mexican students at the high school. 2nd, as an alternative, they approved the cost of tuition and transportation to send the Mexican students to a high school somewhere across state lines in Kansas City, Missouri. Satarino Alvarado, the parent, and other Mexican-American parents refused both offers. As questions of segregation emerged, local newspaper stories described how the Attorney General, the governor, the Mexican embassy, and the U.S. Department of State became involved because it had caused an international conflict. It was reported that a treaty between Mexico and the United States may have been violated, and a lawsuit was looming. In the end, there was no international conflict. The allegation of a treaty violation went nowhere, and the Alvarado case did not go to court. While this case was clearly about rejecting Mexican students from a public high school, it was reasoned that Mexicans were not covered in the state's segregation laws. The Alvarado case was resolved by local authorities because they realized segregation beyond the 8th grade was hard to justify. Mexican youth in Kansas City were allowed to attend Argentine High School. Just so you know, Luz Alvarado, Jesse Alvarado, and Marcos de Leon integrated Argentine High School in 1926. Clary maintains that the Alvarado case was a partial victory because school segregation would end at the 8th grade, that Mexican youth were given access to a high school education. He said it was a step forward. Clary was correct. It was a step forward. We hypothesized, however, that school officials were not overly concerned. They knew the number of Mexican-American students would not change the racial composition of the high school because very few made it that far. Most Mexican-American students were pushed out of school before they reached the 8th grade. I want to finish the Kansas City story with a photo Jared and I found at the Topeka Historical Society. It's a photo of a school in Kansas City. We did not use this image in our book because we did not study religious schools. I show this photo because it's compelling. It tells us that Mexican children were not only segregated in the Kansas City public schools, but they also attended separate religious schools. Let me now turn to the last case in California. I want to talk about an event where California legislators tried to pass a bill in 1931 that wanted to legally segregate Mexican-American children in public schools. This became an important moment in California history. Historian Irving Hendrick found that in January of 1927, the California Attorney General offered the opinion that Mexicans were Indians, thereby permitting school districts to segregate them. The Attorney General advised lawmakers to support a bill that would permit school officials to legally segregate Mexican children. The school code in California at the time read as follows, quote, "The governing body of the school district shall have the power to establish separate schools for Indian children and the children of Chinese, Japanese, or Mongolian parentage," unquote. By January of 1931, Assemblyman George Bliss introduced Assembly Bill 433. The bill wanted to amend the language of a section of the school code. The amended language read as follows, quote, "The governing body of the school district shall have the power to establish separate schools for Indian children, whether born within the United States or not, and the children of Chinese, Japanese, or Mongolian parentage," unquote. The amended language was key. They added, "whether born within the United States or not." Politicians believed that if they made this change to the school code, school districts would have the legal authority to segregate Mexican children because of their indigenous roots. Lillian Hill was chief of the Bureau of Attendance and Migratory Schools in California. She became a forceful critic of the bill. She understood the consequences of the proposed law. Hill communicated with powerful politicians and told them that the bill was nothing more than a veiled attempt to empower school boards to segregate Mexican children and set up separate schools for them. She told them that Mexican children were already attending separate and inferior schools. Given Hill's position in the state, she came across powerful individuals who wanted Mexican children out of schools. Some communities were refusing to educate them. Others were allowing them to attend school part of the day. Hill explained how some individuals wanted to work these children, quote, "like slaves in the agricultural fields," unquote. They also wanted to keep Mexican communities isolated. Hill told politicians how this bill was a dangerous piece of legislation. Other groups and organizations opposed the bill in California. The editor of the Independent Daily News, a newspaper in Southern California, for example, wrote a scathing response to the bill. In an op-ed piece, the editor described how the Bliss bill was, as you can see, un-American and how it was an injustice to decent citizens. He described how Mexicans were making important contributions in the state, yet he explained how they were being treated like animals. The editor also ran a political cartoon. The cartoon shows a teacher in a classroom. On top of the cartoon, it read, "shall not be denied on account of race, color, or," and it was left blank. At the bottom of the cartoon, it read, "bill to segregate Mexican children in American schools." The Bliss bill was defeated. It was voted down. There was too much opposition to this proposed law. I'd like to conclude and leave you with several thoughts. Public schools were places where Americans were created. They became the institutions that gauged who was and who was not allowed to enter the American mainstream. As many of us know, some European immigrants had a difficult time when they came to America. In 1919, Elwood P. Cubberley, Stanford University professor and dean of the School of Education, believed that the coming of Southern and Eastern European immigrants harmed America's national stock, that they corrupted America's political life, and saw them as inferior because they lacked Anglo-Saxon cultural values. Even though Cubberley saw Southern and Eastern European immigrants as inferior, he believed American public schools were able to transform them into good Americans. Cubberley and others like him, however, did not consider the assimilation of Mexican immigrants and other groups of color. It would serve policymakers, educators, and those in positions of power well to recognize what Mexican Americans experienced in American public schools. I am not saying that if we become familiar with this history, everything will be fine. It won't. It will not. What I'm saying is that if we become familiar with this information, we will realize that the segregation of Mexican Americans has always been part of America's educational landscape. It was never legal, but it was widespread. So widespread that the well-known Swedish economist Gunnar Myrdal, in his 1944 book, An American Dilemma, The Negro Problem and Modern Democracy, who was funded by the Carnegie Corporation to study the black condition in American life, also saw how Mexican immigrants were treated in the United States. He saw how they were kept in positions similar to that of African Americans, how they were segregated, and how they were not allowed to assimilate into the American mainstream as other European immigrant groups were allowed to do. Whether recent immigrants, longtime residents with American citizenship, or those with deep roots in southern Colorado and northern New Mexico, Mexicans were forced to live in segregated communities. Jim Crow laws were unofficially aimed at them. They attended segregated school facilities. They were not expected to meld into the American mainstream, and they were seen as a mongrel race. But unlike the experiences of African Americans, the segregation of Mexican Americans was different. It was different because it evolved in ways where laws did not have to be ratified in order to foster their segregation. This was central, and this is what made their experiences so complicated. Their experiences were riddled with legal contradictions. They were legally white, socially colored, and they were rejected from the American mainstream. It was an elusive quest to belong in the United States. I hope I have been able to present new information, a part of American history that is not acknowledged, an educational history that is not part of the American imagination. Through the efforts of Mexican American communities, grassroots organizations, government entities, allies, and supporters, progress has been made. We move closer to equality. Yet, the struggle continues. What I have learned from a lifetime of studying this topic is that the struggle is not over. Much more needs to be done. But I am hopeful. I am hopeful because a new generation of researchers are being trained. They are stepping in. They are writing, challenging educational inequality, and they are generating new knowledge about past and present conditions. I hope we can get to a place where no group is seen as inferior in American public schools. Thank you.